Good evening, everybody. All right, settle down now. We're all very excited. Welcome to the American Academy in Berlin. My name is R.J. McGill. I'm the editor of the Berlin Journal and the head of communications here at the American Academy. And you are all here to see Mariana Candido speak about her subject. And the title is Beyond Queens and Captives, Women in Angola, 1500 to 1800. And she is this semester's Nina Maria Garson Fellow in History. The Nina Maria Garson Fellowship in History, which is focused on the pre-19th century, was established in 2011 with the generous support of the late and great Nina von Maltzan, a founding trustee and the granddaughter of Hans, getting a little choked up because she passed away last year, and the granddaughter of Hans and Ludmilla Arnold. It's an honor to have Nina's husband, Lothar von Maltzan, here tonight in the audience. Welcome to you, sir. Mariana, it's an honor to have... Mariana, it's an honor to have you here as the Nina Maria Garson Fellow this fall and to learn more about your research. It was also an honor to have you in the Berlin Journal for this issue. If you've not read it, it's in the foyer. Please pick up a copy. She has the lead-off essay that sets the tone for the whole focus section, and it was really a pleasure working with you. Often at the Academy, we invite local scholars within the field of our fellows' expertise to introduce their lectures. That will happen tonight. And tonight we have the honor of welcoming Dr. Edna Banhum to introduce Mariana and later to join her on stage. Did I say that totally wrong? Gosh, I practiced. Didn't work. And Edna will join her on stage afterwards for a quick discussion and then lead us into the Q&A. And now I will introduce Edna just briefly. I had the pleasure of sitting next to her at dinner, and it was great. Edna Banhum is a historian of science and a writer on arts and culture. She received her PhD from Princeton in 2017 and an MPH from Columbia, I guess a few years prior. Based in Berlin, she's written for The Atlantic, Esquire, Frieze, The Guardian, London Review of Books, and The Nation, among many others. She's the co-editor of a book called After Sex, a collection of essays, poems, and short stories about, quote, why people need free and universal access to abortion without apology, unquote, which is due out in November. And also the author of A History of the World in Six Plagues, How Contagion, Class, and Captivity Shaped Us from Cholera to COVID, which comes out next year with Simon & Schuster. Edna holds awards and fellowships from the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science, the Ludwig Maximilian Universität, Camargo Foundation, and Baldwin for the Arts in upstate New York, among others, and a recipient of a 2023 Robert Silvers Foundation grant for works in progress for her project, Freedom to Choose Abortion Access in Germany, Haiti, and the United States. Edna, thank you for being with us tonight. She's also a student, or was a student, of Mariana, I learned. The plot thickens. But before I hand over the mic to you, Edna, here's how the evenings work. The fellows hear this every single time. Mariana's talk will last about 30 minutes, followed by a brief discussion with Edna. Then there's a Q&A to open up the floor to you. If you have a question, simply raise your hand, and our colleague will bring the microphone to you. If you are joining via Zoom, type your questions, which we'll try to get to, into the Q&A part of the platform, not in the chat. And we will, again, we'll try to get to your questions and apologize in advance if we cannot. So, Edna, the floor is yours.
So, can you hear me? Or yeah, perfect. I'm going to move here because I'm quite short, and I want to make sure people see me. So I am very honored to be introducing Mariana, who, as you stated, I was a student of Mariana's back when I was a PhD student at Princeton. And the first year, actually, I took a course with you in 2011 on pre-colonial African history. And one of the things that I appreciated about you as a scholar and also just as a professor is that you really tried to ensure that students felt welcome, that they could refine their craft as a historian, and that they could be creative with the archive. So it's such a pleasure to express my gratitude for someone who has been part of my journey for earning a PhD. But at the same time, I also did not continue in academia, perhaps partially because it is quite difficult to maintain, but I see you and know that the field is benefiting. So now for the formalities, which is Professor Mariana Candido is a specialist of West Central African history and during the era of transatlantic slave trade, and she's originally from Rio de Janeiro. She's also professor, she also has a BA in history from Brazil and master's in African studies from Mexico and a PhD in African history from Canada. Before joining Emory, Professor Candido taught at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, Princeton University, where we met, at the University of Kansas, and also at the University of Notre Dame. Her research interests include forced migration, colonialism, empire building, gender, slavery, and the afterlives in contemporary societies. Mariana has published work that examines economies, the social and political impact of transatlantic slave trade and Angola, and her single-authored articles and books mostly also focus on African women, which I think we'll hear a lot about today. Professor Candido's publications include An African Slave of Slaving Ports and the Atlantic World, Benguela and Hinterland, which received an honorable mention in the competition for the Herskovits Prize. In addition to that, she's published Fronteras de Esclavización about Benguela from 1780 to 1850. She's also published with Adam Jones, African Women in the Atlantic World, Property, Vulnerability, and Mobility. She's published with Carlos Liberato and Paul Lovejoy and Renee Soldrer de la France on the Lacos Atlánticos. In addition to that, she's published the text Crossing Memories, Slavery and the African Diaspora with Ana Luisa Arago and Paul Lovejoy. Her articles have been published in Slavery Abolition, as well as in History in Africa, Social Sciences and the Missions, Tempo Portuguese Studies Review, Journal of 18th Century Studies, Afro-Asian, and also African Economic History. She, in addition to her extensive writing, Professor Candido is one of the editors of the African Economics History. So her scholarship and collaborations are a testament to her expertise as well as to her dedication. So I would like you to please join me in welcoming Professor Mariana Candido to the stage.
Thank you for this very kind introduction. And I want to make sure that I time myself so I don't talk too much. So first of all, I have to thank Dr. Bonomi for this kind introduction and RJ for the welcome remarks. I'm extremely grateful for the American Academy in Berlin staff, in particular to Joanna King, who has been working very hard to make sure that everything runs smoothly tonight. So if things go wrong, I am responsible, not Joanna. I also appreciate the fact that I have present here the ambassador of Angola. It's an honor to have you here, but also that the Brazilian embassy is represented here. I also appreciate the fact, but also that the family of Nina Maria Garrison is also remembered here. It is an honor to have this fellowship, and I really appreciate this opportunity in a moment where there are very few funding opportunities for historians who work on African history. So this is very meaningful for me because there are very few scholarships available for people like me who work on African history, particularly on non-Anglophone areas and periods before the 20th century. So being here is special, not only because I am in this amazing city, but also because there are very few opportunities to someone like me. So tonight I will talk about this new book. It's a new book. I haven't written much, but I'm willing to try some ideas here with you, in part because it will help me for the end of the semester. So I'm really tapping into your knowledge so I can improve my writing in the months that I have ahead. So this is a book that covers over 300 years of history, a long period marked by early contacts with Europeans, Portuguese conquest, the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade, the centralization and the collapse of different states, the growth of local forms of slavery. I also focus on abolition and eventually to the transition to trade in natural resources, moving away from the trade in human beings that had dominated this part of the continent. My book ends with the so-called scramble for Africa in the 1880s, when European powers divided the African territories into spheres of influence in the Berlin Conference. So this book is an attempt to historicize gender exclusion in Angola. It grew out of my frustration as a historian and as a journal editor to read articles and reports that project contemporary exclusions into the past. So if you read UN and World Bank reports or news article in general, you will come across sentences such as this one, and I quote, "African women have difficulties accessing finance for several reasons: poverty, limited employment in formal sectors, and cultural barriers to land and property ownership," end of quote. Arguments that African tradition, in many brackets here, but African tradition prevents women's access to resources are everywhere, from NGO websites, UN reports, and even the work of fellow scholars. These statements are dangerous and very vague, and they suggest that there is something particularly African about women's poverty and exclusion. And this is not what I encountered in the archives. For the past 25 years, I have been going to Angola, going through archives. I'm going to share some images with you. And if there is something that I do not encounter, it's women who are passive historical actors. It's quite the opposite. So what I decided to do here is to channel my anger and frustration into a new book where I am challenging some of these statements and problematizing the trend to see inequalities and poverty rooted in Africa in the so-called African traditions rather than a very recent creation. So the place that I will be discussing today is this vast territory that hopefully you can easily locate in the map, but it includes the colony of Angola that you see with the pink boundaries here. It's a territory that in certain moments also included the boundaries in yellow, the colony of Benguela in the south. But what I want you to remind you is that there is an overlap between the contemporary map of Angola and what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the historical colony of Angola and some of these states surrounding this place, such as the Kingdom of Congo that you see on the top with green boundaries, and the Kingdom of Matamba and Ndongo that you see in the lower part. It is important to stress, however, that no one who lived in this territory before the 20th century saw themselves as Africans, as West Central Africans, or as Angolans. I'm using these terms just to facilitate our understanding of this place, but not to project unity into a past. This is a past shaped by competition and fragmentation, and you will understand in a moment more about that. People were organized under political and linguistic groups that you can see here. They competed for resources and survival. And conquest, colonialism, and the slave trade, all events that took place between the 1500s and the 1800s, increased differences in this part of Africa. And these changes affected men and women in different ways. This book also examines women's economic, political, social, and religious roles in the history of this vast territory. In part because, while doing research, I came across several examples of women in the document. This was something that I was not prepared to encounter. In fact, I didn't expect to encounter African women in colonial archives, but they are everywhere. They are in documents such as this one, which is a burial record dating back to the 1770s, and it's located in the Catholic Church Archive in Luanda, which is a incredible building dating back to the 17th century and has an incredible collection of documents. But they are also very rich documents located in the brand new inaugurated National Archive in Angola, documents such as the one that you see there on your right. Yeah, on your right, that describe the presence of women as traders, rulers, and farmers, but also women as healers and captives. One of the first written accounts detailing women's experience date back to the 16th century. So this is an account put together by someone who never visited Angola, but who heard a lot about Angola. This is the official historian of the Portuguese crown who decided to compile some of the news he heard about Angola. And according to him, and here I quote, so Barros described how Catholic missionaries advised the ruler of Congo, the Mani Congo, and here I quote him, to put aside his many wives and remain with only a single one as the Catholic Church commands, end of quote. So Barros, who never went to Angola, clearly report on the importance of women in the court. He later on comments that the soon-to-be excluded spouses allied themselves with other noble women in order to prevent the King of Congo to convert to Christianity. According to Barros, women clearly understood that conversion to Christianity would represent political exclusion to them. So here's a guy who never went to Angola, who is in the 16th century, is clearly making remarks about women, influencing rulers, women who move freely in the court, but also provided guidance, and who are opposing Portuguese presence and conversion to Catholicism. But besides these rich primary sources, we also have very rich visual material available for Angola, such as the 17th century watercolors we see here. Women are clearly identified, and some of them have detailed comments about the behavior and the activities that women perform in Angola. Besides these rich documents, we also have an incredible collection of legal documents, such as the court records that are here. This is not an official archive. This is a storage room or the courthouse in Benguela, and have extremely rich documents detailing the participation of women in events. And I will talk more about that later on. What I want to stress here is that the variety and the scope of these documents allow historians to go beyond the history of noble women from the Kingdom of Congo that I mentioned before, or even the wealthy merchants that have received some attention in other parts of the continent. These type of documents that are available in Angola allowed scholars to focus on traders, on farmers, but also on enslaved women who tend to be marginalized in other types of records. So with colleagues from the Universidade Cachavala Buila in Angola and the Max Planck Institute for Legal History in Frankfurt, we have been trying to identify women who acted as litigants in these court records dating back to the 18th century. And I can talk more about this project if anyone is interested in that. So I'm not going to lie that it's not a challenge to reconstruct this slide, to put together these different puzzles and create a coherent narrative about women in the past. But I think this is something that should be done, in part because we don't have books that focus on women in the long period during the transatlantic slave trade. We have specific studies, but we don't have an overall study accessible so people can understand what was happening there. This is a territory that has a very long history of settlement, long-distance trade, contact with different distant regions, and is a region that has been inserted into the global economy since the 15th century, because the Portuguese arrived there and forced the population to be involved in global economy. Another point that I think it's always important to remember when we talk about Angola, when we try to understand the history of Angola, is that this territory is the place that lost the largest number of enslaved people to the transatlantic slave trade. No other region in the African continent lost so many people as what is nowadays Angola. I'm talking about over 5.6 million people who are forcibly shipped to the Americas between 1500 and 1866. This is a slave trade that lasts well into the 19th century, and it targets young and healthy men. So as a result, the population that remain in what is now Angola, it's mostly women because it targets lots of young men. So places also become spaces dominated by women because the men were kidnapped and removed from their society. And as you can see in this map, I also find that it's important as someone born in Brazil to recognize that Brazil is the place that received the largest number of enslaved Africans in the Americas. And this is an important thing that I always try to remind people. So women were everywhere. In Angola. Women occupied central roles in West Central African societies, and today I will focus in some of these cases. I will try not to be exhaustive because I know that we ate well and it's late in the day, but I want to provide some examples so you leave today knowing that women occupied central roles in Angola. Women were rulers, women were merchants, women were powerful figures in the society. And the fact that we don't talk about it has a lot to do with historians and the kind of work that historians do rather than the non-existence of these documents. I also find important to remind people that African women's labor was essential for the running of their societies, but also because African women's bodies became the space to justify slavery, racist violence, and oppression. And this is important not only for African history, but to anyone interested in understanding the African diaspora and the world where we live in, that it's shaped by racism and intolerance. Particularly towards Black women. So the Ngoyo people remember Manigoyo, who you see in this slide, as their founder. Manigoyo is remembered as a historical queen who had to face exile and migration before she settled in a new territory, giving origin to a new settlement. She gave birth under duress while on the run and is represented in this ivory sculpture holding her newborn baby close to her breast. This sculpture represents the founding king, Queen Manigoyo, and holds power to protect the Ngoyo people until nowadays. Like other African societies, the Ngoyo embody the ancestor. Manigoyo also become the ancestor of every Ngoyo person. So Manigoyo is the ancestor who is represented in this object. An object that ironically is not in Angola, but this is another topic. This object represents a historical event, the foundation of the Ngoyo settlement, but it's also a symbol of power, and a woman is literally at the center of the story. Manigoyo is not the only woman who is remembered as a founder. We have plenty of other examples in Angola. In fact, we have women remembered as founders in the case of the Lunda Empire, perhaps the most important state in Central Africa in the 19th century, and in other places as well. But I will not exhaust you with women remembered as founding leaders. What for me is surprising is to realize that despite this clear evidence of women as the fact that women are remembered as political founders, very few studies examine the gender nature of statecraft in Africa, particularly in Angola. But perhaps the most famous African West Central Africa ruler was Nzinga, who ruled Ndongo and Matamba, the territories that you see here, Ndongo and Matamba, who ruled these two territories in the 17th century. Nzinga was a descendant of the Congo elite who broke away from her royal lineage and founded a new state. Nzinga clashed with the Portuguese traders and Portuguese forces. She negotiated terms of the slave trade with Dutch merchants, and eventually she became a national hero. Nzinga is represented in this big statue, one of the very few statues that have been made after the 40 years of civil war that affected Angola. And I think it's quite revealing that Angola decided to select a woman as one of the first statues built after the Civil War. In 2013, a Portuguese Angolan production was made about Queen Nzinga. And earlier this year, Netflix launched a docu-series, African Queens, produced by Jada Pinkett Smith. Nzinga has attracted a good deal of attention, primarily because of her presence in historical documents. Nzinga is everywhere in the archives. We have very rich visual documents that inform the presence of Nzinga, but she's also remembered in traditions and in collective memory. Nzinga's access to power reveals the intricacies of leadership, competition, political instability during the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade. More books have written about Nzinga than any other woman, so I would try not to talk much about Nzinga, but it's almost irresistible, in part because she lives large in the African diaspora. People talk about Nzinga, people remember Nzinga, and she's remembered as this famous warrior. But also because Nzinga produced lots of written documents that are available in different archives. So for a historian to find a letter written, I don't know if Nzinga wrote the letter, but certainly Nzinga signed the letter, is always a joy to find an African woman represented in a piece of paper, such as this one that you see here. But Nzinga is not the only woman who ruled over territories in West Central Africa. What I've been trying to do since I arrived here is to identify each one of the rulers, and I have plenty. I think it can become a chapter, in part because Europeans were always surprised to find women ruling. But this clearly indicates that there was nothing that prevented women from reaching political power in this part of the continent. And this is something that needs to be remembered because in several places, women have a hard time reaching political power. Although it would be nice to focus on founding mothers and on Nzinga, we also need to remember that the majority of women who lived in this part of the continent didn't live as free people. There is plenty of information about captives, women who remain in captivity in Angola, and also people who were exported to the Americas. And unlike in other places in the African continent, we have a wealth of records about women. And hopefully we can fill some of the gaps and not represent women simply as this image, as a massless type of homogeneous people who we don't know their names, we don't know the stories, but try to bring the stories of captivity and the experiences that these women encountered. And this brings me to the case of Juliana. Juliana is a woman who lived in the interior of what is nowadays Benguela, so in the interior of Angola in the mid-18th century. She lived as a free woman until a raid attacked her village and resulted in the enslavement of dozens of people, including Juliana. She was separated from her family and sold into different villages until she arrived in the coast of Angola, and a Portuguese colonial officers bought her and gave her a new name, the name that she comes across in the documents, Juliana. Juliana was employed as a domestic slave. Learning about her fate as a domestic slave, Juliana's family tried to locate her and send an emissary. I'm talking about mid-18th century, okay? Her family found her enslaved, sent an emissary who contacted Juliana's owner and negotiated her freedom. The Portuguese trader, greedy, didn't accept the payment that the emissary had for her, who had brought an enslaved woman to free Juliana, and demanded the delivery of 2 enslaved young men and 10 cows. He recognized that he was asking a lot, but he realized that Juliana's family was in a rush to free her, so he saw it as an opportunity to profit. The negotiator, the emissary, was unable to deliver what the this captain, this Portuguese guy, requested, and he was forced to travel back to the Juliana's village. The tragic event is that on his way, his caravan was raided. The emissary was probably enslaved or murdered because he simply disappeared, and he never went back to pay the freedom of Juliana. Afraid of the reaction of Juliana's family, the Portuguese guy, Captain Pereira, decided to provide her with a conditional manumission letter in 1765, which is what you see here and what started this legal process. So faced with this cumbersome case of someone who was declared free but forced to live in captivity, someone who her freedom had been paid or partly paid, the colonial judge decided to hear Juliana's case. It looks like Juliana approached someone. For me, it's not very clear how she was able to do that, but she managed to talk with the colonial judge. The colonial judge heard her case, not in Portuguese, which indicates that where she was from. She spoke in variations of Umbundu, and he declared that Juliana's case was a clear example of illegal enslavement. He declared that this was a repugnant case. You could not have someone in captivity while you had received her freedom prize. So there are very interesting points about this case, and I will not have time to go into much detail. But what I want to stress here is the fact that an enslaved woman managed to tell her story, and that her story has survived. And it's still there in the archives for us to remember this. And this brings me to my last point today, the existence of wealthy women in Angola. With the expansion of the transatlantic slave trade in the 18th century, towns along the coast of Africa quickly became women's space. And Angola was not different. Women were the majority of the population in the town of Luanda and in Benguela. One of these women was Florinda Joanes Gaspar, the daughter of a powerful African chief who acted as a trader in markets in the interior and along the coast. As you can see in this document, in 1861, Florinda requested a land plot, which was registered under her name. So it's very odd to find women requesting land plots and being granted land in 1861. So that case called my attention, and that led me to try to understand who was this woman. So I start a puzzle of trying to put together the life of this woman, and this is how I found out that she was the daughter of a powerful chief. So I crossed information from baptism records, marriage records, ship records, and it became clear that I had encountered a case of a powerful merchant who showed up in different records. She's everywhere. She's commanding trade. She's lending money to Portuguese traders. She's not the kind of a small player in the economics of Benguela. She's managing lots of businesses. And because of that, she shows everywhere in the records, but also because she married a man from Brazil. Her husband, Francisco Ferreira Gomes, was a Brazilian-born exile who had committed a crime. For me, it's not clear what was his crime, but he committed a crime and arrived in Benguela to serve in the colonial army. In several documents, he was identified as a black man from Rio de Janeiro, my hometown. Without connections, he did what many Europeans did in the coast of Africa. He married into a powerful family. Florinda Gaspar offered this Brazilian man connections to local traders. She also probably operated as his translator, but connections to African political elites. She was the daughter of a powerful chief. As a couple, they invested in cattle. They had different businesses, including in the production of yogurt and manioc flour to attend the growing demand in different parts of Angola. In alliance with her husband, she ran different businesses, including slave trading. And she became an extremely respected resident of Benguela, baptizing several children in this Catholic church that is still standing. After her husband returned to Brazil, I had imagined that the union would end. Anyway, I can explain that later. There was an attempt to unify Angola and Brazil after the independence of Brazil, and he was forced to leave Angola because he became a troublemaker. And rather than divorcing him, she continued to operate. Now she was managing business on her own. And I come across several records where she's lending money to important Portuguese traders who needed her help to finance their business. My frustration was that I couldn't find her will or her inventory anywhere in Angola. And believe me, we went through these documents. We have created a catalog. We have identified these documents, and I couldn't find her. And it was because I was looking at the wrong place. It became clear that in 1863, she had died, but in Brazil, not in Angola. So she was a woman. She was a Black woman who moved freely in the Atlantic world in the 19th century, in part because she was extremely powerful. She was the daughter of an African chief who married a Brazilian Black man, and in Rio de Janeiro, she becomes a large slave owner. In her inventory, which is available in the National Archive in Rio, I can go through her property, and it becomes clear that she had over 22 enslaved people and 13 different houses in Rio, including very close to the Valongo Wharf, which is the place that has received over 1 million enslaved Africans who arrived in this place. I will not have much time to talk much about Florinda Gaspar, but I think it's quite an interesting story because it places her not only in African history, but also in Atlantic history as well. She's someone who invested in enslaved people. She travels back and forth, and she has some degree of protection. And this past summer, when I had a chance to go to Brazil, with a colleague, we finally identified one of her properties, which is still standing in Gamboa, which is truly a miracle considering the state of the neighborhood. So, like Gaspar, many other wealthy merchants control business in Angola, and I can certainly talk more about them later on. But what I think is remarkable is that even though women occupy leadership positions for over 3 centuries, this situation did not last. The devastating effects of the transatlantic slave trade, combined with the colonial expansion after the Berlin Conference, led to a series of restrictions that excluded women from political and economic roles during colonialism in the 20th century. By the early 20th century, when Angola was under Portuguese control, there was no longer a Black woman as a chief or as a business leader in Angola. So my goal in this book is to show that women were rulers, women were merchants, religious leaders, but also the bulk of the workforce in West Central Africa for over 300 years. It is based on archival research, identifying specific cases, so we can also bring specific cases into light and move away from generalizations about African women. Understanding the history of women in Angola will help us to challenge several misrepresentations of the African past, such as that there are no women in the documents, or that women were silent victims of patriarchal society, or that women have always been excluded from power. I hope what you take from today is that women did not represent a homogeneous group of people. There were clashes between women, but they were there, and they are in the documents. So I believe we have much to gain if we understand African women's historical roles, and we need to recognize that the exclusions that women face nowadays are not rooted in so-called African traditions, but they're in fact very recent creations. And if they are recent creations, we can change it again. So thank you for listening to me, and I'm looking forward to any questions or suggestions that you might have. Thank you.
So thank you so much for such a enlightening presentation. And first of all, can people hear me? Or okay, perfect. One of the things that I appreciate about the work you've done, even while I was a student and reading some of your work in progress, as well as what we just heard, is how you're thinking about dismantling the stereotypes that people hold today, and really going deep into the archives to see the names of individuals, and more specifically women, who were active in asserting themselves through political self-determination, or even in cases of, as you indicated, trading. In one of the chapters you sent me to read beforehand, you more specifically had written about the ways in which some women, as traders, were also consumers. And so in the Angola context, not only were they involved in the economic wealth accumulation, but they saw themselves and redefined themselves as people who were, in some cases, Christianized, speaking Portuguese, cosmopolitan. And I wanted to know, because what was happening along the western coast of Africa at that time was, in some cases, people in Brazil, as Florenda's husband had done, left the South America, the Caribbean, and resettled in Senegambia and present-day Benin, Nigeria, and so forth. And I wanted to know, how did people make sense or reckon with those who came back, and what coming back meant, especially if that might not have been the place that they were originally from. So can you please speak to that if you want?
I can try, in part because very few research has been done to the so-called returnees in Angola. Mônica Lima, who teaches the Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro, has a very important work on that, and hopefully it will be published soon, where she looked on formerly enslaved people who, for different reasons, relocated to the coast of Africa. Some of them were forced to leave after a series of slave revolts in Brazil, but some went for personal reasons, including a desire back to Africa kind of movement. But perhaps the ambassador would know better than I, but I don't think there is a memory, a collective memory of being descendants of these families. Angola is very different from Senegal, for example, or from Benin, where these memories are alive. And I think this is a topic that deserves more attention, because clearly these connections were there. It's just that more people need to pay attention to them.
And one of the things that comes up in your work is this tension between upper-class women in Angola, or what is now Angola, and those who were enslaved, and the extent to which people, on the one hand, their wealth was built off of the unpaid labor and captivity of other women and also men. How, as a historian, do you reckon with that complicated history in which people may not have necessarily questioned that power dynamic, and or I know that you were obviously anti-slavery, but you're still trying to make sense of the wealth that was accumulated on the one hand, but also the class dimensions, and even some of the inter-ethnic conflict that was happening at the time. So how do you work through that?
Yeah, I think this is the challenge for anyone who engage with these documents. I think it will be very convenient to write a beautiful history of women in power. It would be nice, but I would be denying an important part of this history. And for me, as a historian, it's important to bring this tension, to recognize that you can only have wealth because it led to the exploitation of other people. That these things, they coexist in many ways. And the challenge is to understand how they coexist in different contexts. And the danger is assuming that what we see in the present existed in the past. And for me, this is the most difficult aspect, how to separate what I'm seeing in the present and not to let shape the way I'm describing this past, which I think is very difficult, and I don't think I'm successful very well. I don't forget where I was educated, the language that I think, the kind of work that I do. So for me, it's also very important to speak about slavery, to speak the impact of the transatlantic slave trade in this part of the continent, and the fact that we cannot forget that 5.6 million people left from this region is a huge number of people. And this led to a series of problems that Angola is still facing, in part because young, healthy, and the most talented people were forcibly moved from there and created wealth elsewhere. So for me, it's about thinking about the past, writing about these powerful women, but also remembering that most women are not recorded in the archive. We don't know their names, and how to write about them in a respectful way, but also recognizing their humanity, not only the violence that they experience in life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And in your work, you have multiple interventions. So, for example, one of the claims that previous historians of Africa often made about West Central Africa is that it was an empty, vast land, not necessarily civilized or quote unquote civilized. And part of what your work does or shows is that, well, not only were people physically there and present, but they had their own kingdoms, and in some cases, women, queens, also being part of the ruling elite. And to an extent, that is very visible and in the records. However, the statement that you just made, which is very well documented, that 5 million people were also displaced, forcibly removed, did leave an opening and a vacuum of sorts. To what extent do you see, or how do you reckon with, on the one hand, the stereotype of the emptiness with the displacement that made that land and that space empty, also being kind of part of the historical process through the transatlantic slave trade, as well as colonization that would eventually occur?
Well, the good thing about Angolan history is that lots of people have written about Angola, so it's easier also to be a historian of a place that has received lots of attention. But it also a region that has very good archives, and I'm always astonished because Angola is a country that faced a very long decades of civil war. Well, first of all, the anti-colonial war that was devastating, and then the long civil war, and yet these documents are there. And I think this is a testament of people who work in these archives, but Angolans in general who realize the importance of their history, and they have kept these archives well, despite all the infrastructure problems that they encountered in their daily lives. So I think in part it has to do a lot with a commitment of Angolans in maintaining and keeping these places there. But it also has to do with a series of scholars who have maintained different levels of commitment to Angola in writing this history. So scholars based in the US, scholars based in Europe, but also scholars based in Angola. I think one of the challenges is that most of the scholarship is in Portuguese, so not necessarily available to non-Portuguese speakers. There is a very rich production going on in Brazil about African history, not only about Angola, but different places of the African continent, extremely rich research, and yet is only available in Portuguese. And I think there is a very dangerous issue that affects academics in the global north, is to ignore the scholarship produced in the global south as non-relevant or not theoretically refined and so on, when this is not true. There is very good work. So for this new book, I am doing new research, but I'm also tapping in the work of historians who have worked on these women and have written important work, but they are not necessarily available to a large audience who can only read English. And I will recognize that I'm not the first one doing the research. There are lots of historians. We talked about during dinner how Rosa da Cruz e Silva was an important historian who has written about Nzinga, and very few people know about her work outside of Angola. And I think this is important. I also feel like I have a role in bringing attention to the scholarship that is done in Portuguese, and it's very important. So hopefully more people will feel curious and start reading scholarship in Portuguese.
Mm-hmm. And I guess also related to the archives, one of the things I found so fascinating about your work in general is that you don't just look at the archives, which we see how much work it takes to go back and forth between Brazil, Portugal, Angola, but you also rely on local historians as well, people who can, not just in Portuguese, speak to maybe family stories or other, or what people would often refer to as oral histories, to be able to add another layer to it. To what extent do material histories also help to fill in the gaps for your work? You did show the statue of Nzinga, and as we saw, it's currently in Paris, I take it.
Correct.
And how do you work with materials and also people who might have moved and making it so that you fill in those gaps when the archive may not always provide all the answers?
Yeah, this is something that I'm trying to learn on the go. I'm trying to use more material culture, in part because there is rich collections of Angolan objects in different parts of the world, including here in Berlin, and hopefully I will be able to see these objects, but also in Angola. And I think it's important because as you were mentioning, these women were also consumers. They were tap into global networks of traders. They consume products coming from India, textiles coming from India, perfumes coming from France, knives coming from the Netherlands. So you see that they are consuming, they are connected to different markets. And I think it's something that I haven't been able to done much, but it's something that I'm planning to expand as I go, to see more of this material culture and bring more in my work, because I think it helps us to visualize how people represented their past.
Mm. And one thing that you mentioned in your talk that I think the work kind of does need to be done on the wider African scale, which is how do we write histories of African women without reproducing certain stereotypes? I think of the works of Leila Abu-Logod, who is an anthropologist and is mostly focused on North African and Eastern Mediterranean women. And I wonder, given the kind of complexity, ethnic, linguistic, as well as just fragmentation of people not having identified as African before the 20th century, to what extent would a kind of large opus work on such a topic of African women history, or even a feminist history, really be appropriate for such a large region of the world? How do you see yourself fitting into that, or would it have to be multiple histories kind of coming together?
Yeah, I think I try to focus only on Angola because this is what I know best. But I think it's important, and it fits into different scholarships. It helps us to understand different parts of the continent. And I think there are things that need to be teased out more about gender identity in Angola. So one of the things that I'm trying to understand, for example, is the fact that several sources also make reference that Nzinga had wives. So what does it mean, women who had wives? Is it because it was helping with domestic labor? Was it because it was perceived that to be a powerful person, you have to have wives? And I don't know if I can extrapolate that to other parts of the African continent. You see, I think this is the danger that Africanists have, is that we work on very specific places, but we are pushed to talk about the entire continent. And I think this is quite dangerous because it's a vast territory. People speak different languages, very different historical experience. So I try to control myself. Although people are always asking me to talk about other places, and I know that I will create this. I criticize people who do that, and I want to protect myself, especially because this is being recorded, and somebody would say, Mariana is making claims about women in Tanzania, when I'm not. I'm just focusing on Angola.
So I have one more question before we let others ask away, which is, you mentioned this moment or this possibility in which Brazil and Angola could have been united and what that might have looked like. I kind of want to hear more about that because there are ways in which, when I think about the Caribbean and South America, during the revolutionary struggles with Haiti launching that, and then what is now Colombia and other countries liberating themselves from Spanish, from Spain ultimately, but not hearing so much about the kind of South American, African solidarity or liberation projects that could have been. And can you elaborate on what that would have looked like and how would that have created a different political landscape for the better, perhaps? Or
I don't think so.
Okay.
I wish it was. For a different reason. And Roquinaldo Ferreira, who teaches at University of Pennsylvania, is writing about this. And I'm waiting for this book to come out, which is basically a movement that exists in Angola in the moment that Brazil becomes independent in 1822 to move away from Portuguese control and create and join the newly independent Brazilian state. So the Brazilian state would exist in Brazil and in Angola. But it was mainly slave traders who are behind this movement, thinking from the growing pressure coming from Great Britain to bring the slave trade to an end, to get away and say like, oh, let's unify with this newly independent country, heavily committed in maintaining slavery alive, so we can operate this trade in the South Atlantic. So unfortunately, it's not about liberation, it's about exploitation. But I guess this is the history of Brazil.
And we, in case people don't know, Brazil was the last country to abolish slavery, and the one before that was Cuba.
In the Western
West.
Hemisphere.
So, I was trying to be optimistic after my conversation during dinner, but I guess I'll stick to pessimism. So I guess with those initial set of questions, we can open it up to others. Raise your hand and I'll call you, and then you can just ask Mariana whatever you want.
Not really.
I see someone there with curly hair.
Anne Marie Slaughter. I'm a Holbrook Fellow here and have the pleasure of being a fellow with Mariana. It was a wonderful talk, and just the pictures also that you've recovered from the archives kind of bring it to life. I wonder who you imagine your audience to be when you're writing these books. Obviously, fellow historians. You're an academic historian, and there's a rich and growing literature. But I'm struck that we have the ambassador from Angola, who is a powerful woman, I think I will assume. And so I wonder to what extent you think you're also writing for Angolan women or African women, and do you think about writing in a more popular vein for those audiences?
Thank you for the question. My goal will be to write. I think about my students. I think this book grew up my frustration, as I mentioned, but also the fact that I was asked to teach a class on African women, and I realized the very few textbooks available accessible to undergraduate students. So I'm thinking about my undergraduate students who need a general book that can quickly summarize different events. But I'm writing in English, and most people in Angola do not read English or can afford books published in the US. So I am also struggling with this. So hopefully this will be a book that later will be translated into Portuguese, as I have done with my previous work, because for me it's important that my work is available in Portuguese, it's available in Angolan, so Angolans can read my work. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to be writing for 5 specialists on Angolan history that exist in the United States. So yeah, that would be my goal. But I hope I will be successful in doing that. But it's also very difficult, especially because English is not my first language or my second language. So there is also the challenge of writing in my third language. Yeah.
Can I ask something?
Yes.
I would like to know, in Brazil, you have got also very strong black women. Some of them, they come from Africa. Why your interest in Angola?
Why
In women in Angola?
My interest, I'm from Rio. I'm from Rio de Janeiro, the city that has received the largest number of enslaved Africans in the Americas. So for me, Angola was always present in my life. When I was doing my BA, I had opportunity of teaching Angolan refugees who had arrived in Brazil and the children needed to go to the school system, so they needed how to read and learn very quickly in Portuguese. So I worked with them, and I learned a lot from these Angolan refugees, because I realized that I didn't know much about Angola. I knew stereotypes about Angola, and this is how I became interested in Angolan history. So it was when I was doing my BA. And of course, I had a good professor in the university who taught a nice class, and like, oh, this is interesting, as is similar to other stories. But I also think that it's important to write about these women. Historians have done important studies on specific women. So let's say some of the Donas that exist in Luanda or in Queen Nzinga. But I think it's important to put these stories together, but also to combine the powerful women with the women who didn't have power and who are also there and are also part of the history. And for me, as a person born in Brazil, Angola is part of my history. I cannot deny that, and I think it would be irresponsible not to pay attention to Angolan history. Every time I go to Angola, I'm reminded on how it looks like Rio. It's perhaps the place that I feel most comfortable in the world, because I can understand the culture, the language, the code, everything is familiar. It's certainly way more familiar to me than being in Berlin or being in Atlanta. So for me, it's important to write about this history. And because for 2 decades, I have written about the slave trade, about very dry topics. And it's like, you know what? Now that this is being recorded, no? Now that I've been promoted, I can do whatever I want, and I'm going to write about women because these documents are there, and I think it's important to write this history. And I resisted for a long time as a young woman in the academic world. I refused to write about women because I said I refuse to be in this box, and now I said, now I can do it. And so I'm very thankful for the opportunity to have the time to think about it and to write about this history, which I think is important.
So green bandana, and then person with black shirt after it.
Thank you. Good evening. Thank you, Mariana. This is really a privilege to listen to you. Talk especially about women agency in Africa, because it's not every day that we hear people talk about women agency, women as protagonists of their own history from Africa. And I'm glad that you have the humility to tell your audience that you specialize on Angola and you want to really explore and to bring to the limelight what women can do there. And of course, I trust and believe that your colleagues in other spheres are going to follow suit and do exactly the same thing. I just want to thank you here for bringing, in very light mood, some of the key issues that bring about the stereotypes about African women agency. You just mentioned that Queen Nzinga had wives. Of course, to the audience here, that will sound queer in the list. But to the African, that is most normal. I'm sure our ambassador here can explain a few things about that. So maybe now that you have the privilege to do what you enjoy doing, I wish you would write more on those so that you can diffuse much of these stereotypes about African women, about subjugation, about patriarchy, about oppression, and about inequality. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The person with the black sweater.
Mabel.
Thank you. My name is Justice, and I have actually a few questions. One would be, thank you first for the book. I think it sounds very interesting from different aspects. And my first question would be because we tend sometimes to use different wording for actually maybe the same thing when it's when we talk about the European context or the African context. And you use, for example, the word achieve, and I would like to understand what achieve is from our understanding at the moment. That would be my first question. The second question would be because you also talked about the fact of being surprised about certain things, and my question was what we are actually surprised about. Are we surprised about the fact that women on the African continent had leading roles, or are we surprised about the fact that in the Western world, we don't know about these women? That would be my second question. And then my third question, and then you don't have to answer all the questions, but
I like a challenge.
yeah. And then my third question would be also if you would at some point compare maybe the roles of African women and in African societies and the women in Western societies, so that we can understand why they were not talked about or silenced, or they disappeared also, or they're not known until today. Yes, that would be my questions. Yeah.
I would try. Thank you for your questions. I will start perhaps for the last one to compare with Western. Well, very clearly, I live in a country where no woman has been in charge of the country. And I come from a country that only one woman was elected president and removed from power. So I think we have a very different situation. Angola has not had a woman in power after independence, but before, as I just said, there were several women who exercised political power. So I think this is important to recognize, but also important to recognize that it's not only political power, but also economic power that some women enjoyed in the past. So my surprise was not about finding women in positions of power. My surprise was finding so much information about women in documents. Usually historians... So when I was training graduate school, I was told that I wouldn't find these things in the archive, particularly in colonial archives, that I would have to go and interview people to find information about the majority of the population, the African population. And my surprise as a historian was to find this detailed information in the archive. And this is something that doesn't happen in other parts of the African continent or even in other parts of the Americas. There is a very important scholarship on the invisibility of enslaved women in the archive. And I think this is very true for some parts of the Atlantic world, particularly for areas that were colonized by the British and the French. But it's not true for the Iberian colonies or the former Iberian colonies, in part because the Portuguese were obsessed in taking notes about everything So I'm not saying the Portuguese colonialism was nicer to women. This is not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that they are obsessed in controlling, and because of that, we have rich information. It's not that women had more space in Portuguese Empire. I'm not suggesting that. It's that we have this information in the archive, and I think this is quite unique in comparison with other parts of the African continent. This doesn't happen in other spaces. It's not that women didn't have power, but it's simply because they were not recorded as such, particularly in written documents. So this is my surprise. Yes, I use the word chiefs. I know that this is a terrible word to use when talking about African societies, but I use because people understand that I'm talking about rulers. And the word chief was not used in Angola. Usually the term is soba, somas, or for example, in the case of the king of Congo, is Mani Congo. So there are specific terms that were used in different contexts. But I had 30 minutes and I have to use words that will be easily accessible in different contexts, although they are terrible words and they have a very strong colonial connotation. So I'm fully aware that I have used
the word statesman or in a European context, or what wording would you use in a European context?
I should have used rulers. I think that it's because it's an open term that it means different types of political administration, so it can be from smaller societies to a larger state, and we have a combination of different political organizations. But so thank you for clarifying that and giving me a chance to explain this, so I appreciate. Thank you. I think Mabel had a question. I see many of my fellows. Now I hope these are the easy questions.
So maybe Mabel first. And then,
Thank you, Mariana, for a really incredible lecture. And I appreciate, the accessibility, which I think is you're talking about like how to work in these complex archives and where to find information and, what essentially are you seeking in order to sort of find these individuals? And thank you for clarifying, like, what is the difference between, let's say, British North America, or maybe British Caribbean, versus the Portuguese. But I'm still wondering, in terms of these women, and I'm thinking here of Jennifer Morgan's Reckoning with Slavery, which again is a U.S. context, how Black women had to negotiate the law and also the economy, and because you can have power, right, to be an actor, or you can become a piece of property. Correct. With no, and so I'm curious, as you're going through this, how do you understand that if what you have are essentially legal documents or church documents, or how much do they start to give you a bit of maybe the social contour in which people are establishing, let's say, their class position, or maybe the more intimate relationships that, allow you to have a certain kind of agency that wouldn't show up, let's say, in a will?
Mm-hmm. And I think it's one of the challenges, is how to construct these lives aware that they are profoundly shaped by the type of documents that I have access to. And in some cases, these women who enjoy a certain degree of power, they lost their power. And I have written about them, about a series of powerful merchants who enjoyed lots of protection when they are in one specific place, but the moment that they move away from their community, they were kidnapped. So it's very clear that they are powerful in a context, but they are extremely vulnerable in another one. And I think this is also an important story to tell, and how people use different mechanisms to protect themselves. So it is about how we dress, and you see that in the past as well, how women would use clothing as a way to protect themselves so that they cannot be mistaken from a different class or from a different legal status. And for me, what is always frustrating is, I don't know if it's frustrating, but it's to encounter these moments where even women who might look like, oh, this is a happy story, she's enjoying so much power, and very quickly, they are not, for example, they might inherit it, and I'm trying to put together a story now of a woman who inherited property, but then she has to go against the judge and everybody else because she's too young. So you see how there is always new barriers that are created, that even though she should have access to the property because the law allows her to do so, there is something else that will limit. And I think this is also an important story to recognize how women in different contexts also had to face these different barriers. But I agree 100% that the type of archive shapes the type of stories that we can tell. And most of the people never had their lives registered in these documents. So I'm really using some cases to imagine what might have happened to other people who I don't have the documents because they were shipped to Brazil or because they were murdered and they never had a chance to make it into a document. And this is ultimately what historians face, is that we have moments that were recorded and we try to put together these lives without having access to what happened to people.
Yeah. Like typically diaries and letters will give you more of a daily contour of someone's life.
But we don't have this type of documents. Usually, I work with documents created by men who make reference to women. These are not documents generated by women, so I'm not talking about that, unfortunately.
Person with the glasses and watch and black. Yeah, that's you.
I like.
I'm trying to be gender neutral and not ageist or anything.
So I also want to thank you for this really nice talk. And I'm wondering, so in Angola, until these days, there are a lot of traditional kings or sobas, however you want to put it, who do not only have political power, but they also have power. They have less political power than actually in these days than spiritual power, and they are super important people. If there are any conflicts in some groups, they are those people who can help resolve these conflicts. So they go back to a long time to pre-colonial times, and everybody is talking in Angola. Everybody is talking that there are also soba women and queens to these days. Of course, also these queens should go back long time, having had spiritual power and juridic power, so to say, also since a long time. So I'm wondering, did you find out anything about these women kings, these queens or women sobas in before 1880 or even after 1880? So was their power similar to men's power? Did they have the same spiritual power, juridic power? Yeah, what do you know about this?
Yes, I have come across some reference. We don't have as much, not as rich as we know from Nzinga that generated rich documents. But every single soba would control not only political power, but also spiritual knowledge, access to land, but also the ancestors would facilitate communication between the ancestors and the living world. So women would also exercise these spaces, but also a juridical power, could decide, settle matters within communities. So yes, this information exists with not as much details as we have for the case of Nzinga, but they do exist. And it doesn't seem that women had anything preventing them from accessing power. It seems to be fine, No one challenged the power of women because they were women. So I think this is something that is much more a Western problem than necessarily something that affected people in the past. And I also think it's important to realize that the people who left from this region, they arrive in Brazil, they are used to women in power. And then they arrive in Brazil and there is no woman in power. It must be very unsettling for people who are used to see women ruling, arriving in urban spaces and not seeing women bossing other people when they were used to that. And I think we also need to realize that. We might think that people were not aware, but they are coming from societies that women enjoy power, economic power, social power. Yeah.
We have time for one more question, but I know that there was someone over here before that person, so I think that, yeah.
No, yeah. Fellow as well.
So, this was an amazing talk because you're an amazing presenter. I mean, the energy, the personality, and the conversational style. You must be an incredible teacher as well, it's clear. I wanted to ask you...
Is it being recorded? Can I say Astrid is here, my colleague Astrid is here.
You could see an older male professor grading. And this is a fantastic work of both revision and restoration. So the archives are telling a different, non-cliched, non-stereotyped story. I wanted to ask this. I was curious about the woman who was able to be successful as a merchant, both in Angola and then in Brazil. The story you often hear about the slave trade, along with piracy, plantations as early factories, this is the nascence of capitalism. Mm-hmm. So she did well, but what was the economy like back in Angola? Was this already proto-capitalist? Was it something else? Do you have another name for it? I'm very interested in how she negotiated those two things.
Well, thank you for the compliment. It's always nice. So Dona Gaspar invested in sugar plantation. So yes, it was a form of capital accumulation. But something that I didn't mention and that I find fascinating about her case is that unlike her husband, who has his skin color registered, recorded in documents, there is no mention to her skin color in any document. Most wealthy women from Angola, they have no mention to their skin color. So I think there is something to be said about race there, being also used or not being used to protect these women. And in the case of Gaspar, she is the daughter of an African chief, an African leader who enjoy lots of power. So I'm assuming that she was a black woman. And she arrived in Brazil, in Rio, in a place that was receiving lots of enslaved people on a slave ship. She came on a ship that had people in the cargo who were not free, but she arrived as a free person. And I think we need to understand this mobility of free black women and how they managed to protect their freedom in a context of intense violence. This woman was never enslaved in Brazil. But we know that other women who were free didn't have the same situation. So I'm also trying to understand these because I agree with you. We need to understand. I don't want to dismiss the violence of the slave trade. I think this is an important story to tell, but we also need to recognize that there were black people who traveled freely in the Atlantic world. And we don't talk much about these stories. And I think they are important. They're important to my students. They're important to me. I want to know more about these stories. So yes, I will leave it there.
We also have an online audience, and we have several questions. I just want to ask one from the online audience. Thank you so much for your presentation. I was wondering if your research and your book will focus particularly in the region of Banguela, or also other important trading regions such as Luanda or Ambris.
Yes, I am trying to expand beyond Benguela, although Benguela is very special to me. But I'm also tapping into other cases, including women from other regions. Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
I think we can applaud.
Thank you.